Hey, welcome back everybody. It's part 2, day 2, continuing to tear down the Allis C. It's much warmer today, there's more light today, so we're going to get down to it. But first, a couple bits of housekeeping from the last episode. So when I do my voiceovers, sometimes I forget something I want to point out, and then I don't realize it till after the video has already gone up. So one thing I want to say that I didn't, in the last episode, or I should have said didn't film on the last episode, was the flashlight kind of hit the block and you couldn't really see what I was talking about. But if you look at the block here, there is some coolant on the deck as well as some drops of coolant in the sleeves, or in the cylinders, excuse me. And it's not a lot. The coolant when it came out wasn't milky. The oil doesn't look like it's got coolant in it, so if the head gasket was failing, it either just started or it's a very, very small leak. So I don't think that's where the problem came from when this machine died last year. And addressing that, I didn't really say what happened last year. Basically, we just moved the chicken tractor for the last time, and I was going to put this away, bring it right into the shop, because I had been thinking about just, giving it a tune-up. And on the way to the shop, it actually sent some sparks out of the exhaust and then refused to run. Couldn't get it started back up. So don't know exactly what caused that, but I honestly thought I was going to see a lot more carnage, like a bent valve or something, when I pulled the head off. Thankfully, we don't have any of that yet. Third thing I want to talk about, I mentioned some of the valves had rust on them. And it was on the surface, and some of them have it on the stem inside of the head in that portion. The ones that had rust on was exhaust and intake valves, so it wasn't any one set of valves in particular, so not a lot of hints there. Anyway, with all that being said, let's get back to tearing this tractor down.
Alright guys, so we're going to start with removing the radiator. There's 2 mounting bolts underneath it, as well as the upper and lower hoses. Just remove the hose clamp, and off it comes. Now what I'm doing here is just taking the belt off of the generator and unbolting that from its bracket. Next I'm going to take the fan off, and that just unbolts from the water pump pulley with the 4 bolts you see. Now I'm going to take the water pump off, but due to that oil leak by the governor, there was so much dirt and crud on here, as you can see, that it required a fair amount of scraping before I found the bolts. Now I'm removing the 2 bolts from the magneto and pulling that off. As you can see, a lot of gunk in there. Now I'm pulling the governor cover off. Again, had to scrape a lot of dirt off to find those bolts. And off that comes, containing the throttle rod, and that's the mechanism the governor pushes against. Gonna have to take a close look at those weights. They did seem a little loose on their shafts. Now back to that water pump. It's held on by 3 bolts, and again, they were completely hidden under all that dirt. Now it's time to drain the oil, and this got a little interesting because as you can see here, when I pull the cap off, no oil. Let's check the dipstick. Full. Interesting. Let's give it a gunk check. And there it is. It was full of oil, however, you'll see when we take the pan off, there was quite a bit of sludge in there as well. Well, now the time's finally come to split this thing apart. So the first thing we're going to do is put a stand underneath the back half of the tractor. I'm using this crate made out of 4x4s, which also gives me a nice spot to put my tools. Then I re-rigged my chains, and I'm going to undo the 4 nuts that hold the front steering column onto the front of the engine block. And these are about twice as thick as a regular nut. And one of them, actually, they must have lost the original last time they were working on this because it had just 2 regular 1/2-inch nuts on it instead of the longer one. After you pull the nuts off, it just wiggles right off of its studs. Now I've re-rigged again to the engine block, and after pulling the 4 mounting bolts and nuts, it slides right off. Now we're going to pull the pressure plate off of the flywheel. Simply undo the bolts. Clutch is down to the rivets on one side. And then we can pull the flywheel. Simply undo the bolts. And set it down on the floor in a controlled, crashing manner.
Saved it.
Luckily, I had enough control over it that it didn't do any damage to the teeth. However, some of them were a little ground from the starter. Next, we're going to undo the 3 screws holding the oil pump on. And with a little tap, it comes right off. Now we're undoing the front pulley. There's a nut and jam screw on there. Just undo the nut and then the screw. And that is a straight shaft, not a tapered fit. But mine was a little rusted, so I used the gear puller to get it off. Alright, now's the moment we've all been waiting for. Let's get the oil pan off. There's one stud on the front, all the rest are bolts. And this was a weird size, I couldn't find a wrench that fit it. Oh yeah, look at that. Good inch and a half in there. Now we're going to take the oil pickup off, and the head to this unit was loose, but the standpipe that it was on was tight. And now we're undoing the bolts that are remaining for the front cover. Tap with a wood block and hammer, and off it comes. That's the thrust surface for the camshaft there. Just taking some of the old gasket off and removing the governor shaft. Now I'm going to start snipping the wires and the cotter pins for the connecting rod caps and the main bearing caps. Next, I'm going to remove the pistons and connecting rods all in one shot. This engine does use shims in between the caps for both the main and the rod bearings, so try not to lose those. I'm not going to reuse them, but just to keep track of them to see where they were at. And then out come the pistons, connecting rod and all. And now it's time for the main bearing caps. And it was at this moment I realized I screwed up. I didn't take the seal retainer plate off the back before putting it on the stand, so off she comes, back onto the engine hoist. So now I'm just unbending the fold-over locks. A little tricky while it's hanging on a hoist. And we'll just undo those bolts and it pops right off. Now we can take the crankshaft out. Crankshaft journals all look pretty good, as did the camshaft that I'm pulling out here. And there is a small plunger with a spring in the front of it to help control the thrust. Just be careful you don't lose that while you're pulling it out. And we're getting down to it now, pulling the tappets out. And last but not least is the oil filter manifold and base.
So there you have it, guys. We are almost down to bare block. Next time I'm going to be pulling sleeves. I have to go make the sleeve puller this weekend. And after that we'll be cleaning and prepping the block to put the new sleeves in. So stay tuned for that. As always, guys, thanks for watching. I really appreciate it. Can't wait for the next one.